In this video, we are going to dive into JavaScript, and we're going to pick up where we left off with adding a little bit of interactivity to our About page for our quiz game. So before we jump into it, JavaScript, like we talked about before, is responsible for the behavior and logic that is embedded within your website or app. And with it, you can build really complex things like games and data visualizations, but you can also just sprinkle it into websites to add smaller effects like modal windows that pop open, like a shopping cart window. And one thing that I want to make clear, so we've done HTML, which is a markup language, and CSS, which is a styling language, but JavaScript is a programming language, so it's a higher level of complexity. It's more general purpose, so it'll be a little bit more in terms of new concepts as we're diving into it. So let's check out our About page. We've got our HTML here, and we're going to throw our first line of JavaScript in here. So like with CSS, where we could open up a style tag in the header and put some CSS in here, we can also do that with a script tag, which allows us to drop some JavaScript in here. And because it's common in programming languages for your first line of code to be something that prints out hello world, we are going to do that. So we're going to type alert and then open close parenthesis, and into that we are going to type hello world. And I'm going to drop a little world emoji in there and then end this with a semicolon and save it. And so now if I flip back to my browser, here's our alert window that's popped up, and here's that text that we put inside of the quotation marks. So we've got our first line of code. Like with CSS, this is not where we usually want to put JavaScript. So we are going to do the same thing that we did with moving our CSS to a separate file. So I'm going to create a folder in my project here, called JS. And into there, I'm going to create a basics.js file. And we can grab our hello world and drop it in here. We can get rid of the script tag. And we're going to create a script tag. There's an option here for an emit abbreviation that has src for source. So we can click that. And the source, we want to do the same thing as the href here. We want to define a path that is relative from our about.html to our basics.js. So it would be / and then js/basics.js. So this is almost done. We also want to add type equals module here. So this enables certain import and export features that are related to modules. We'll talk about them in a little bit, but without this, that syntax is not enabled inside of your script. So we throw type equals module, and then we're good to go. So let's change this. Let's say hello from basics.js. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page, and we can see now hello from basics.js is working. So this first line of code that we wrote, this is technically called a statement, where we have a line of code ended by a semicolon. So this statement has the browser open what's called an alert window. An alert window, as we were seeing, is this window that pops up and then also prevents the user from doing anything to the web page. So these are good. This command is good for learning, but not terribly great in terms of user interface. When you're actually building applications, you don't really want to use alert windows very often. So we can also put a comment in here, like we did with HTML and CSS. It is a different syntax for comments in JavaScript. So 2 slashes tells the browser to ignore anything that's written on this line. So we can say this statement prints out a message in a modal window. And if we run it, this code is completely ignored, so nothing new happens in our browser. There is also a multi-line comment in JavaScript, which starts with /* and ends with */ like our CSS comments. So this is a multi-line comment. So the browser is going to ignore anything that's from this start to this end character. So again, nothing has changed about our page because we're just making comments. And as we saw with CSS and JavaScript, there are references that we usually want to pull up when we're working. So for instance, if we're not sure how to use alert, we can go to our browser and search alert and maybe MDN or alert and JavaScript, and we will get reference articles that explain how that particular command works. In this case, what we're Googling is a function that tells us here it displays an alert dialog with whatever content you pass in. So in between the parentheses, you put the message that you want to display, and then that ends up showing up in a dialog box. So keeping MDN handy is still very, very useful in the JavaScript world. So next up, let's make an error and see what happens. So we have this line of code, and let's say we forgot something, like we forgot this quotation mark. If I delete it, we're going to see a couple of things. We are going to see some of the syntax highlighting, which we talked about in a previous video, disappear. So we are now getting this parenthesis, which is being colored with the same color as hello from basics, which it wasn't before. So the syntax highlighting is a way to give you a cue that something has gone wrong. Also, we're seeing that VS Code has a linter included within it, which is looking at our code and possibly showing us some problems. So here it's telling us we have something called a string literal that has not been terminated. And if you want to see all the errors that you have in your code, so we have one here and we also have one here, down here at the bottom, clicking this will pull up all of your warnings, errors, and in my case, I also have a spelling extension. So this is giving me some warnings about spelling. So if we try and run this code that's broken in our browser, we can see that that alert box is no longer popping up, but our page is still loaded. So we actually have to open our dev tools. So hotkey on Windows F12 to actually see the error message. So it's telling us that it got to an invalid or unexpected token inside of our code, and it happened on line 2. And if we click on this, it is going to, whoops. Well, I was hoping that would open it in our sources tab here. We can just use this error message to go back to our code and look at line 2 and say like, oh, here is where it told us that it was parsing the file and couldn't figure out what we intended to do here. So when you're working on JavaScript, you often want to have this console window open so that you can see any errors should they occur. Okay, so let's fix that. Similar thing would happen if we forgot the parenthesis or we misspelled alert. Or JavaScript is also case sensitive. If we had typed alert with a capital A, this would also cause an error. And if you're coming from other programming languages, lines of code are often ended with a semicolon to indicate that the statement is finished. In JavaScript, those are optional, sort of. There are a couple cases where they're not optional. What I recommend doing, like with CSS and HTML, is making sure that you have a formatter enabled. So I have in my settings, I hit Control comma to bring up my settings, and then I'm searching for format on save and making sure that I have that checked. And then inside of my file, I'm bringing up my command palette with Control-Shift-P and searching for format and making sure that I configure the default to be prettier, which is the extension that we installed previously. So what that does is we'll format our code. So if we have prettier configured to put semicolons after every statement in JavaScript, it will just drop those in. And if we add a bunch of white space, it is gonna, when we save, go ahead and format it all consistently. So same with CSS and HTML, having a formatter in there relieves some of the burden, the mental burden for you thinking about how to format your code. You can just write your code, make sure that you get the syntax right, and let your formatter take care of the formatting. I'm going to comment out this line. So I'm going to put my cursor there and hit Control / to comment it out so that we no longer have this window constantly, this alert window constantly popping up. And let's actually print something to the console now. So this prints to the console in the dev tools console.log. Same structure with opening and closing parentheses, opening and closing quotation marks, and then we can say hello from the console, drop in a waving emoji. And if we check it out, now instead of having a modal window that pops up, we are just getting a message in our console that is being printed out. And the console is really useful for development, but is not useful for displaying any information to your user. Your user should never have to open the dev tools to interact with your website or your application. So just know that even though we're using console.log a lot in this script, that is just for demonstration purposes, and normally what you would want is messages popping up in your HTML, which we can also see how to do that. One way to inject some content into our web page. So let's add a comment here. This gets added at the end of the body element. So document.body gives us access to, inside of our HTML, this element. And then document.body.inner HTML plus equals. And we'll talk a little bit more about this syntax after we talk about variables and objects. But for now, just know that this line of code is talking to the body and adding something to its HTML. And then we can drop a string in there. So however we would normally write an HTML element, like maybe we want to drop a paragraph in there that says hello from JS. Save it, check it out. It gets added to the very bottom of our page. And if I look in my Elements tab now and scroll down to the bottom, we can see that paragraph that was being added there from our JavaScript. So there are better ways to insert something into HTML. We'll talk about them after we cover variables. This method here is for appending something just to the end of the body. So let's talk about variables. I'm going to add a comment here that variables are like boxes for data. So the idea with a variable is that oftentimes we want to hold on to a piece of information. Sometimes it's like a welcome message, or it's the player's name, or it's the player's current score, and we need to store it in some place to be able to refer to it later. And that's what variables allow us to do. And if you're coming from other programming languages, then JavaScript is dynamically typed and loosely typed. And by that, I mean when you create a variable, you don't have to say what type of variable it is. And when you create a variable, that variable is not forced to stay one type. It is allowed to change from one type to the other. If you're not coming from a programming language, another programming language, don't worry about that. We'll see what those mean as we're making variables. I'm going to drop in a URL here. And let's check it out in the browser. So this is Mozilla's documentation. So I will make sure that this is in the canvas, but also if you just search data structures, JavaScript, you will get this page popping up. So JavaScript has a couple of types that are built into it. It has undefined, Boolean, number, string, big int, symbol, object, and inside of object there are a couple of different types. There are arrays and maps and sets, and then you can make your own objects, custom objects. There are functions, and there's null. And today we're going to go through string, number, object, and function. Know that the other ones are out there, and we'll get to them eventually. You can also explore them from this page. So let's talk about strings first. So we're going to create our first variable here. And then we can use an alert to print it out. So we have taken this string. So a string is something that is surrounded by double quotes or single quotes. It's a series of characters that is stored into this box called message. And then anytime we use message later, it just goes into the box and pulls out whatever string we stored in there. So here we should see on our page, welcome to the site gets printed out. One of the nice things about variables, and one of the uses for variables, is when you have a piece of information that you need to use multiple places. So say we wanted to print this out to the console, and we wanted to print this out in an alert box, we could do that here by reusing the same variable in two places. So we'll see welcome to the site, and then we'll see welcome to the site in the console. So let's see, I'm going to add a couple notes here. I'm going to say one possible use of a variable is to define data that is used multiple times. And let's refine this to say a string is a series of characters. So I am going to comment out this alert box so that my Chrome stops popping open with a modal window. Let's take this code that we wrote and deconstruct it a little bit. I'm going to take a screenshot of it. And let's open whiteboard. Let's paste that in and blow it up a bit. Okay, so if you're coming from a language where you have variables and you've worked with variables before, this will be old hat. If you're not, then don't worry. One way to think about this and thinking about variables is that it's kind of like we have a box somewhere in our computer's memory. And on the front of it is this label. This is the identifier. And when we have this line of code that executes, what the interpreter, what the browser is going to do is create a new box inside of memory called message, and it's going to take this string, this value, and put it into the box. So now anytime after this, if we say console.log message, we are telling the interpreter to go ahead and look up whatever is inside of this box and use it in our console.log. So it would just go and grab this string, throw it in here, and print it out to the window. Okay, let's flip back to the code and look at another possible usage of a variable. So another use is to capture some data from the user. So if we're making a game and the player is allowed to create a character, you might want to give them the option to like type in a name, and you want to store that somewhere so you can use it later when you're referring to the character. So we could say something like name equals, and then much like we had this prompt, this alert command, this alert function, we have also a prompt function which allows us to pass in a string that is a question. So let's say, what is your name? So this is going to pop up an alert, a modal window that has a input area, and whatever we type in there is going to get stored into this variable called name. So then if we did something like this, we are taking whatever they typed and then spitting it back out into our HTML. So I'm going to refresh my page here. Let's type in Mike. And then down at the bottom, we can see whatever I typed in gets put back onto the page. Same deal as alert. Is prompt is not a very elegant user interface. It blocks the user from doing anything else on your page. So there are better ways to do this that we'll learn in the future, but it's useful for now for us for learning. The other thing that I want to show you is that, maybe we wanted this name to be wrapped in an H2, or we wanted it to be wrapped in a paragraph. So there's an idea called concatenation where you can take strings and add them together. So if we want this name to show up in an HTML element, we could do this plus and then close the H1. So this is just saying add an H1 tag, an opening tag before name, and then add a closing H1 tag. So now let's run this again, type in my name. We can see it showing up as an H1, and if I inspect it, check it out, it is showing up as an H1 in here. If we want to, we can add some more, like we could say the H1 should start with welcome, comma, and then the person's name. So refresh this. Welcome. Oh, I forgot a space in there, but you get the idea. So the other thing, the other way to do this kind of concatenation where you want to throw something inside of a string is with a different type of string. So if we open a string with backticks and close a string with backticks, this is called a template string, which allows us to insert code into it. So I'm going to do this. So here's our string without the name put anywhere. And then inside here, if we do $, opening curly bracket, closing curly bracket, we can put JavaScript inside of here. Like I can grab the variable name, and now what's going to happen is that when this runs, it's going to go ahead and take whatever the value of name is and insert it into this string. So let me add an exclamation point at the end here so it looks slightly different. I'm going to cancel and refresh the page, and then put in Kate. There we go. And if we inspect this and check it out, we can see, there we go, name was inserted directly here into our H1. So I'm going to add a comment. This is string concatenation. This is a template string. So before we go on, I want to talk a little bit about what are valid variable names in JavaScript. So I've got a link here that I will pull up, and I will make sure that is also in the canvas. Oh, not that one. This one. So if I scroll down here, there's this variable section which describes what identifiers we are allowed to use in JavaScript. And we can start a variable with a letter, underscore, or $. The first letter, the first character in a variable can't be a digit. It can't be a number between 0 and 9. And also it's making sure to let us know that variables are case sensitive. So some examples of valid variable names down here. Let's flip back to our code and we can document some of them. So in general, we are going to use two types of variable naming to start. We're going to have something called camel case. And this is a lowercase first letter of the first word of our variable. And then if we have multiple words, every word afterwards is going to have the first letter capitalized. So we could have something like character name or my top score. So in general, camel case we are going to use for variables, something called functions, instances, objects, most of the stuff you're going to be working with, and then we will have a Pascal case, which is uppercase first letter of every word. So ship speed, cart, total, and this we're going to use for constructors, classes, which we'll get to later. So these are variable naming conventions that we're going to be using. And then there are the rules that we just saw for what actually constitutes valid or invalid variable names. So we can't have a variable like one name because a variable can't start with a number. But we could have name1. That would be valid JavaScript. There are also going to be some cases where maybe you want to name a variable and you will run into a word that is reserved in the JavaScript language. Like if you wanted to create a variable called const, that's going to be a problem because the interpreter, the browser engine that is reading our code and trying to execute our code, is not going to know what to do when it gets to this place because const is a reserved word that is part of the syntax of JavaScript. If you're ever curious, there is a website that someone made that I will also make sure is linked. Mother effing JS variables, and we can type things in here and see dynamically like, oh, one name, that's wrong. Name1 is valid according to the JavaScript standard. Okay, so we've talked about string variables and we've talked about naming conventions. We can also store numbers in variables. So a number variable stores an integer or float. So an integer is a whole number and a floating point number is a number that has some kind of decimal place associated with it. So for instance, we could have, maybe we're making a shopping app and the player or the user is buying a couple of things, like maybe they're buying a plant that costs $2.50 and a pot for that plant that costs $12.25, and maybe like a bag of soil that costs $13. And we can do this to just add those numbers together and then print them out. So console.log, the subtotal for your purchase is, and then insert this variable, subtotal. And we can see here is the subtotal for our purchase. I am going to quickly scan. Okay, so just so that we don't have this prompt popping up every time we reload our page, I'm going to comment that out, and then I'm also going to comment out this line that used the variable that we were storing our prompt in. Okay, so good. Nothing is popping up. One thing that I'll note here is that I did this 13.0, but JavaScript doesn't care whether it's an integer or a floating point number. So this getting rid of the decimal place will result in the same math operation. So we can add a note here that another use of a variable is to perform a computation. So here we're performing a mathematical operation. We are building essentially like a little shopping cart that can add up the cost of items together. We can similarly do this with prompts, like if we're letting the user buy a couple of items, we can say prompt, what is the cost of item 1? And I'm copy and pasting this to create item 2, item 3. So now when we load our page, we're going to get 3 prompts. And I'm going to make a mistake here, and we'll see what happens, and then we'll see how to fix it. Item 2 plus item 3. And then do a similar console.log. And also, it's good to note that I'm using a different variable name than subtotal. If I try to use the same variable here, declare it twice, this is going to result in an error when we run our JavaScript. So I'm making sure that this is called item subtotal. Let's check it out. Let's see what happens. So cost of item 1, let's say it's $10. Item 2 is $20. Item 3 is $10. Oh, whoops. Okay. So the thing that we're running into here is that every time I save this file, live server is refreshing this page, which is triggering our code to run at different phases of us editing it. So when I saved it after creating item 1, 2, and 3, before I did this printing out, it was trying to run that code. And then when I changed it and saved it again, it was waiting to run that code again. So if you run into that issue, just make sure that you cancel out through all of your dialogues, and then refresh your page and try it with all of the code changes loaded. So here I'm going to do it again. 10, 20, 10. Huh. Well, that's weird. So what we're seeing here is instead of those numbers being added together, they have been concatenated. So the characters 1, 0 are followed by 2, 0, followed by 10, 0, or 1, 0 for the 3 numbers that we typed in. So when we add numbers together, like we're doing here, JavaScript knows what to do. And when we add strings together, like we were doing here, the H1 welcome message name, it does something different. It jams those characters together. And so what we're seeing is that anytime we do a prompt, the value that we get back is a string. So it's interpreting those 3 numbers as strings and then just jamming them together, concatenating them. So if we want this code to work how you would expect, we actually have to convert these from strings to numbers before we can actually use them in this mathematical operation. And JavaScript has 2 options for taking a number and converting it. So we have parse float and we have parse int. And the way this works is we take our item and we wrap it in parentheses, and we're passing that into this function called number.parseFloat. I'm being a little hand wavy here with calling things functions because we haven't talked about functions yet. We'll talk about them towards the end of the video, but we'll unpack this syntax more as we're going. Okay, so I have, I'm going to bring this bookmark down so that we can see the full line all together. So I have each item parsed to a float, and then they get added together. Be sure to cancel these and get a fresh set of code running, 10, 20, 10. And then we can see the subtotals, those numbers actually added together. Okay, so I'm gonna bring my sidebar back. So that we don't have a bunch of prompts popping up, I'm gonna go ahead and comment this out. And let's talk about ways that we can create variables. So far we have been using const, this command here, to say that we are creating a variable. And there are actually 3 ways to create variables. This is actually specifically called declaring a variable. there is const, let, and var. And const is for creating a variable that is not allowed to be reassigned. So this is identifier is not allowed to be reassigned. So once we create plant cost here and say that it's equal to 2.5, we're not able to later on go and say, well, now the plant cost is equal to 5. This will, if we check out our browser, tell us an assignment to a constant variable has been made on line 44. Line 44 is the problem here. So const is really useful for variables that you don't want to reassign or you don't want to be allowed to reassign. And my general recommendation is when you're defining a variable, unless you know that you need to reassign it later, just stick to const as your starting point. And then let is for identifiers that are allowed to be reassigned. So let's say we are making a game and the player has 5 lives. And then they go and they pick up, let's say they pick up a mushroom in a Mario game and they get an extra life. Let's print this out. And actually, let's say you have no lives left. So this, when we declare this variable with let, we are able to reassign it later to say that, okay, now this variable is equal to 1 plus whatever number it was before. So if we run this, we should see 6 lives left. You have 6 lives left. And as we saw before, if I change this to a const, that's a problem because we are not allowed to take a variable that has been declared as constant and reassign it to something else. So this can be tricky for folks when they see it for the first time. The way that you want to read a line of code like this is start on the right-hand side and then move to the left-hand side. So the right-hand side gets evaluated first, which takes whatever the current value of num lives is. Here it is 5, and we do 5 plus 1, so we get 6, and then we put that into our box for num lives. Okay, so let's modify this number lives a couple more times. Since we have a variable that's let, we're allowed to reassign it. So we could say num lives equals num lives minus 3. And we could say you fell down a couple holes. You now have however many lives left. So we have 3 lives left after starting with 6. And there are a couple of shortcuts for doing this kind of operation where we are taking an existing variable and we are mutating it. Like here we are adding 1 to it, here we are subtracting 3. So a shortcut for saying this is num lives plus equals 1. So this will give us the same result in our console. This plus equals is a way of expressing take whatever the current value is and add whatever we put over here. So we still start with 6 lives. And there is also a even shorter way of expressing this for times when we want to add 1 to a number, just putting plus plus or starting with plus plus. Both of these will add 1 to num lives. They're slightly different operations. Don't worry about that for now. So if I save this and check it out, we should still see we start with 6 lives. So I'm going to say these are all equivalent. Same deal for the subtraction version of these. So we can say num lives minus equals 3. That is the same thing as saying this line that we have here. So we should still start at 6 and end at 3. And we can do the same thing with minus minus, except that that wouldn't work in this case because we're trying to subtract by 3. So we would have to do something like num lives minus minus and then repeat that 3 times if we wanted the same result. So before we leave this section, I do want to add a note to just call out, since I'm trying to call out the places that we use a variable and some of the reasons why we use variables. This is another case here. So another use of a variable is to track some data that changes over time. So here we're hypothesizing that we have some game environment where the player has a certain number of lives, and we need to keep track of that over the course of the player playing the game, where some things will trigger them to get lives and some things will trigger them to lose lives. Okay, so next up, let's talk about another type of variable, which is an object. So this is a type of variable that actually allows you to package up related pieces of data and also functionality, which we'll talk about later, together into one object. So package up related data and functionality together. So for instance, if we're going with the example of thinking about making a game, maybe we have a player in our game, and instead of having separate variables for the player's name and the number of lives and their stats, we actually want to store those in one variable altogether. So here is the syntax for declaring an object. It starts with an opening curly bracket, ends with a closing curly bracket, and then we have this structure where there's a property, colon, and then some value. So you know what, before we go on, let's take a screenshot of this and mark this up in our whiteboard. I'll get a better screenshot going. Oops, looks like I added a little mark there. Oh well. So, when we are creating an object, it starts with this opening curly bracket, ends with this closing curly bracket, and then the syntax is here. This is called a property. And this is called the value. You can think of this as like when we created a variable up here where we said this identifier is equal to this value on the right-hand side. It's a similar structure here. We're saying this identifier name is set to this value, Mike, which happens to be a string. And each of these properties that we declare inside of the object, importantly, is going to have a comma after it. That's part of the syntax of separating out the different properties that are in your object. So let's flip back and keep working on this object. So once we have an object like this, if we need to reach in and access one of these values, we use what is called dot notation. So I can say the player. This is dot notation where we take our variable, which is an object, and then we use a dot, and then we specify the property that we are looking for that exists inside of that object. So we're saying the player.name has player num lives. And if we save this and check it back out in our browser, we should see the player Mike has 5 lives. So this is dot syntax for accessing properties in an object. There is also a bracket syntax that can do the same thing. So let's call this bracket notation for accessing properties. I'm just going to copy and paste this line, and instead of doing a dot and then the name of the property, here we have opening and closing brackets, and then inside of that we pass in a string, or we could potentially pass in a number here to access a property that matches whatever we pass in. So same deal. Let's save this and check it out in the browser. Same thing gets printed out. So it is also common to have objects that have nested objects within them. So for instance, if our player also happened to have stats associated with it, like attack and defense and agility, here we have now defined a stats property, which is just an object. So if we want to reach into the player and say read its defense, we are going to do something like this: console.log. The player has a defense of, oops, make sure that this is a template string, so it starts with backticks. Player.stats. So when we say player.stats, that is going to give us back this object, which then we can tack on .defense to read out the value of the defense. So I'm going to add a period here, and let's check it out. The player has a defense of 3. So it's really common to work with objects and object literals like this, where we define an object and specify the properties as we're doing. And it's common to have objects that have objects nested within them. The advantage of all of this is if we were to approach this the way we had been defining variables before, we would have a whole bunch of separate variables to keep track of. We would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate variables. Here, we just have a single variable that acts as an organizational unit that has all of these individual pieces of data grouped together. This will become even more helpful when we learn about how to add functionality to our objects, which will sort of open up some possibilities as we talk about object-oriented programming in JavaScript. So let's also see a type of object that comes from the browser. So before, when we wanted to put something onto the page, we did this, document.body.innerHTML plus equals, and then we put some content in there. But we can get access to individual objects. So we can actually get an object that represents one of these elements on the page, and then we can mutate it. So we could say, like, instead of this paragraph saying some languages I'm writing, we could reach in and change its text. So this is helpful. Like, let's say instead of having things print out where we're printing them, we're putting it after the footer, which looks not so great. Let's create a new element on our page. I'm going to put it right above these buttons. And we're going to create a div, and a div is just a generic container element inside of HTML. It defaults to being a block level element, and in order to get access to this from our JavaScript, we usually need an ID or a class name. And so I'm going to add an ID, which we saw in CSS allows us to define a unique identifier for this element. So if I save it, there's nothing in my div, so nothing should show up on the page. Though if I go to my elements and scroll into main and look down here, I've got my div, it just happens to be empty. So since it has this ID, js-output, inside of here, we can say js-output div is equal to query selector. So remember how in CSS we were able to define a selector like header or hash logo or dot emoji list. And in the case of hash logo, that said anything with an ID of logo gets these styles applied to it. When we do this document.querySelector, that says look in our HTML document and find an element with this ID. So if I go ahead and print this out to the console window, console.log JS output div, and check it out and make sure that I'm in my console, we can see that div is being printed out. And as I hover over it, it's printing out where it is on our page, or it's hovering over where it is on our page. So what we can do is similar to when we said document.body. So document.body.innerHTML plus equals something. Instead of saying document.body.innerHTML, we can say JS output div.innerHTML plus equals to add some text to it and say, let's make a paragraph tag and let's print out So we're going to drop a paragraph tag into our div. And there we go. Howdy, I'm injected from the JS. If we break this down a little bit, we can actually understand it with our object knowledge now. So this is an object. It happens to have a property called innerHTML, and we are just changing what is stored in innerHTML. We're saying whatever's there, add this to it. Add this paragraph tag to it. So we could add another one if we wanted to. And now we've got 2 paragraphs added inside of that div. So I'm going to add a couple of comments here. I'm going to say this is a DOM. So this stands for Document Object Model Element. So we are reaching into the document and we are pulling out this object that represents our div. And then we are changing some properties, and that is showing up on our web page. So let's see, the next thing that we should talk about, let's talk about functions, and then we'll be able to wrap things up and make those buttons that are on our page actually do something. So a function is a reusable block of code. And this, the structure looks like this. So this is a really basic function where we have the keyword function, then we have a name for that function. So the same thing as naming a variable. So same conventions, we're using camel case here, and we don't start it with a number, etc. Then there are opening and closing parentheses and opening and closing curly brackets. And anything that we put inside of here is considered inside of this function. Actually, let's change this so it looks a little bit more distinct. Let's say hello from our function. So if I run this, we are not going to see this text print out inside of the console window. The last thing that gets printed out is our JS output div. And the reason why is because a function is a chunk of code when we define it like this, but it never gets run until we actually do what is called invoking the function. So if we do say hello here and open close parenthesis, we are actually now telling the browser, the interpreter, when it gets to this line of code, go ahead and look up our function and run whatever is in that function. So now we should see say hello from our function printing out. And if we run this 3 times, that code will get executed 3 times. there is another syntax called an arrow function, which looks a little bit different. We say something like this, where we're defining a variable and we're setting it equal to a structure that looks very similar. We have opening brackets, then we have what's called a fat arrow, which is an equal and then a greater than sign, and then we have our block for our chunk of code that goes inside of that function. And we can print out a string as well. Goodbye from the function. Same deal with our say hello function. This does not get run until we actually tell the interpreter to run this function. So we say the name of the function followed by parentheses, and we get it printing out to our console. And we can do the same thing. If we call it multiple times, we invoke it multiple times, it will run multiple times. And we can have as many lines of code as we want inside of these functions. So let's throw in an extra line here. We'll say, see you next time. So now we have changed the lines of code inside of say goodbye. That will change what happens when we get to line 99 and line 100 here. So we are seeing that function run multiple times, and each time it runs, it prints out whatever is inside of our function. All right, we are going to put all of this together to create some logic on our buttons on our page. That'll be the last thing we do. We'll wrap up this video, and then next time we'll dig into actually making our quiz game. So I'm going to save this. And because I don't want our page having this JavaScript injected and all this stuff in the console window, what I'm going to do is go back to the About page. And up here at the top, I'm going to comment out this script. So remember, Control// is the hotkey for comment, uncomment. So I'm just adding an HTML comment around it, which means that that script will no longer run. Which means that we can create a new script here, and I'm going to call this our About script because it's running on our About page. And inside here, I'm going to create a script tag with a source that points to JS About, and make sure that it has a type of module. So let's do something with our button that says, let's see, where is it? Here. So we're going to do something with our click button, and then we'll do something with our speak button. And so both of these have IDs, so it'll be easy for us to use query selector to pull those out from the document and then mutate them to change them in our JavaScript. So we'll start with click button. We'll say const click button equals document dot query selector and then hash click button, and we can print it out. Make sure that it's working. So when we highlighted it, it is showing us the element in the DOM. If I had made a typo here, we would see null being printed out. So if you see that, make sure that you have the proper ID in your HTML and that you haven't made a typo here in document.querySelector. So we've got our click button. Let's create a function and let's call it on button clicked. And let's just have this console.log you clicked the button. So DOM elements, these elements that we get back when we do query selector, they have a command inside of them, a function called add event listener, which allows us to register some function to happen when one of the events that is built into the DOM is triggered. So one of them that we care about right now is click, and then on button click. So here we're saying anytime this button registers a click event, which happens when an element is tapped, if you're on a mobile screen, or if it's clicked with a mouse button, go ahead and run this function. So our code here, you clicked the button, won't show up in our console window until we go to this button and click on it. And then every time we click on it, a new line will be printed out here. So let's combine this with our knowledge of variables. So we can say num clicks is 0. So we're creating a variable that is defined with let, which means that we can reassign this variable. And anytime this method is called, let's do numClicks plus plus, or we could do numClicks plus equals 1. Both of those would be the same thing. We're taking this variable, we're adding 1 to it, and instead of printing out you clicked the button, let's do you clicked the button numClicks times. So now when we click it, each time we click it, our variable is being printed out. So we've got a button that can actually track how many times it has been clicked. Not only can we print this out to the console, but since we have this DOM element here in a variable, we saw inner HTML allowed you to change the HTML that was inside of an element. There's also something for text content, where if you just want to change the text that is inside of an element, we can just say text content equals something. So we could just take this line here and drop it in here. So what that's saying is when we click on it, take the text that's inside of this element and just replace it with you've clicked the button X number of times. So each time it is printing out to our console window and in the text content of our button. So this next bit that I'll add, it'll be a little bit more advanced, but not too bad. So remember that we were able to define colors in a couple of different ways. Let's see what we got in here. So we've got this syntax where it's RGB followed by a number, comma, a number, comma, a number. So this is the red value, the green value, the blue value. I'm going to grab this as an example and paste it in here in a comment. So we can also not just change the text content, but we can change the style of an element. So if we reach in and grab the style object of the element, we can grab properties that correspond to whatever the CSS property is. And there's a slight translation that happens here. So, color and background color. Let's look at background color. So background color is 2 words followed by a dash in between them. That would not be a valid variable in JavaScript. So when we translate this to JavaScript, we're going to remove this dash and we're going to replace the lowercase c with an uppercase c. So we're going from kebab case to camel case. So .style. Let's change the background color. And we can pass in this. So when we click this button, that style should be changed. And if we want, we can also change the color. And we could pass in white or RGB 255, 255, 255. Those are both ways to specify white. And we could change the border, we could change the margin, the padding, but I want to show you how to generate a random number. So let's do random hue. So this line of code is going to give you a number between 0 and 1. And if I multiply that by 360, I am now going to have a value that goes from 0 to 360. So it's just a random number that goes from 0 to 360. If I print it out, we got 36 point whatever, 5 point whatever, 126 point whatever. So I want to use this, and instead of specifying a color using RGB, I want to use HSL. So this stands for hue, saturation, lightness. And the first parameter that goes in here is the hue. So this would be a red hue. This is 100% saturation, so really a lot of the red color in there, and 25% lightness. So we'll check this out without the random number put in there. So we've got a pretty dark from our lightness, but really saturated red in there. And if you're curious about this, so we're kind of going quickly through Hsl, but Hsl Picker will give you a better idea. So you can see that this is the hue value from 0 to 360. This is the lightness value, which goes from essentially gray to whatever color you have selected, your hue. And then you have your, this is the saturation, and this is your lightness, which goes from black to white. So I've picked like 25% here, and a fully saturated color, and then we're basically going to try and randomize this to get a dark color, a random dark color. So I am just going to drop our random hue variable in here. It's a number between 0 and 360. I'm keeping the saturation and lightness the same. So now every time we click it, we should get a different random color as our background. And the reason why I was doing this using Hsl is because it allows us to choose a dark color, which will have enough contrast with our white text so that you can still read it regardless of what hue is picked. So we went through random pretty quickly. Don't worry if some of that didn't make complete sense on your first try because it's your first programming language, but I wanted to show you something cool that we could do with random. So the next thing that I want to show is similarly going to be a step up in how advanced it is. It uses the speech synthesis API in JavaScript, which is a new API. So it is a part of the JavaScript language that is supported in the latest browsers, but if you're running in an older browser, this like Internet Explorer, this is I'm pretty sure is not going to work in your browser, but if you're in the latest version of Chrome, for instance, this will work. So what I want to do to cap things off is have this speak button that whenever you click on it, it actually speaks something through your speakers. So we're going to do that. Let me throw all of those lines together, and we are going to create a speak button variable that we're going to do query selector. And speak button dot add event listener. We're going to do the same thing, click. The difference, I'm going to show you a slightly shorter syntax here. So remember we saw a different way to declare a function using what's called an arrow function. So this is just a function that I'm defining in line, as opposed to what we did here where we created a function and then we passed in the name of the function. So this will be equivalent. We are just taking some lines of code and making sure that they are bound to the click event. So let's create a utterance, the speech synthesis utterance, and let's say welcome to our fancy game site. And let's customize the pitch, and we'll set it to 1, and we will customize the rate, and we will set it to 1.25, and then we will say speech synthesis dot speak utterance. So don't worry, there's a lot of new syntax. I'm not super concerned about you knowing how to do this. I just wanted to show you some of the cool things that you can do in the browser now. So this should, when we click, create a new speech synthesis utterance. Whatever we pass in here will be spoken in our browser's default voice using a pitch. So this would be the frequency. We're using this sort of standard 1. I think this is the default value, and we're using a rate, and I think the default value is 1, so this will be a slightly faster than the default voice. speech synthesis.utterance. So let's flip back. Oh, let me turn up my speaker.
Welcome to our fancy game site.
So there we go. It speaks. One thing that I would throw in here if we were making our code a little bit more resilient is the speech synthesis API can crash sometimes if you try to trigger it too many times or if you pass in invalid values for the pitch and rate. So one thing that is useful to do is make sure it stops speaking whatever it was speaking before starting again.
Welcome to our fancy game site. Welcome to our fancy game site.
So you can play with the rate and pitch.
Welcome to our fancy game site. Welcome to our fancy game site. Welcome to our fancy game site.
And if you're curious, there are ways, if you just Google search the speech synthesis API, there are ways to actually get the number of voices that your browser has and pick one of those voices and have it speak in that voice. So there are voices for, like, there's an Aussie voice and a UK voice and an Indian voice. So when those are uttered using English, they will be spoken with a slightly different accent. All right, so let's wrap this up. We have covered a fair bit of the basic syntax of JavaScript in our basics.js. So we learned how to print out information to the screen, to elements on the page. We learned what variables were, and we saw a different set of uses for those variables. We learned what an object is, which allows us to package up variables together. And we saw what functions were, which are reusable chunks of code. So whatever you put inside the brackets here is part of that function. And then we were able to take all of that knowledge, so variables and functions and objects, and use that to change some things, some simple things admittedly, but things on our page. And we saw some of the experimental sort of like cutting edge APIs that exist in the browser. So there's speech synthesis. There are also modules for making graphics. So the Canvas API allows you to create 2D and 3D graphics in the browser. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with JavaScript and do in the browser. We are just scratching the surface here. And now that we've got some of the basics under our belt, next time we'll be able to approach building that quiz game.